Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por estar aquí. Mi nombre es Marisol Schultz, soy la directora general de la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara y por eso les doy la más cordial bienvenida a esta que es nuestra edición 38 de la Feria Internacional del Libro. El día de hoy la FIL se viste de gala, pues el Premio Nobel de Literatura Abdulrazak Gurnah, a quien agradezco por su presencia, compartirá con nosotros una charla magistral esta misma tarde. Agradezco de manera muy particular todas las gestiones y la complicidad del grupo Penguin Random House para que todos hoy podamos disfrutar de esta que sin duda será una plática memorable. La literatura tiene la capacidad de alumbrar su tiempo y es un reflejo de las problemáticas y el contexto que vive cada autor. Del romanticismo al realismo, del existencialismo al posmodernismo, las grandes historias surgen de los grandes temas de cada época. Estos son los tiempos en los que el escritor tanzano Abdulrazak Gurnah observa y escribe. Su mirada sensible y aguda son esenciales para encontrar en la marginalidad lo más universal y para mostrar la inevitable vulnerabilidad humana en cada historia detrás de sus personajes, donde el desarraigo y la exploración de identidad orbitan alrededor de sus narrativas. Cada uno de sus personajes se enfrentan a problemáticas de nuestro tiempo, donde la segregación es aún parte de las cruzadas con las que el ser humano debe lidiar. La literatura también puede sensibilizarnos y hacernos conscientes de la infinidad de realidades que se viven de manera paralela a la nuestra en situaciones aparentemente lejanas. Entonces, la literatura es también un escaparate para compartir mundos que de otra manera podría costarnos mucho más trabajo imaginar. La de Abdulrazak Gurnah es una de las grandes voces de nuestros tiempos. Hoy tendremos el privilegio de escucharlo acompañado por la escritora y editora mexicana Socorro Venegas, a quien le voy a ceder el micrófono. Muchas gracias a los dos. Bienvenidos todos. Buenas tardes.
Muy buenas noches. Qué enorme privilegio estar aquí acompañando al escritor tanzano Abdulrazak Gurnah, Premio Nobel de Literatura 2021. Quizás una sabe que es tanto un gran escritor por la capacidad que ha encontrado en sus libros de incomodar, de mostrar en sus personajes los movimientos del alma más genuinos, las miradas que van a revelarte aspectos del mundo que quizá no querías ni siquiera ver. Algo así me ha pasado a mí tras leer a Gurnah. La dicha de entrar por primera vez en la literatura de este autor se la debo y se la agradezco a la invitación de la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara para presentarlo. Los escritores elegimos historias para contarlas, incluso cuando decimos que ellas nos eligen a nosotros. Pero las historias no ocurren en el éter, le suceden a esas personas que llamamos personajes. Y los de Gurnah son maravillosamente diversos, fascinantes, complejos. Se trata, dicho en sus propias palabras, de ricos, pobres, hindús, musulmanes e incluso algunos cristianos de la etnia siri, pero también de los europeos colonizadores, alemanes e ingleses, que muestran el hueso duro de su crueldad o condescendencia. Dibuja con maestría el corazón y la mente de las mujeres africanas que en la relación de opresores y oprimidos siempre serán grandes perdedoras. Abdulrazak escribe desde las orillas, desde el alma de los que resisten. Nos revela los extremos vitales de quienes conocen el yugo, pero también la redención y el coraje para reencontrar un camino. Son, dicho en sus palabras, pueblos reacios a convertirse en súbditos del imperio. Se salen muchas veces del lado ordinario, de la inerte existencia de sus vecinos, pero también, porque así es la vida, podemos verles acobardarse y someterse al relato familiar, con todo el dolor que significa la renuncia. Me interesa mucho el espacio que dedica a la condición de mujeres y niños. Ellas están sujetas al mundo de los hombres, que son sus tutores legales, los albaceas de sus sueños. No éramos dueñas ni siquiera de nuestro destino, dice Asha en la novela La vida después. En ese mismo libro conocemos a Afilla, la niña golpeada a diario por sus cuidadores, una familia que la adopta cuando es abandonada por su padre. Los castigos que le infligen se deben, en gran medida, a que sabe leer y escribir. Una mujer, leemos en la novela El desertor, siempre debía tener un tutor. Por lo general, el padre o el marido, y a falta de ambos, el hermano de más edad. En ausencia de todos ellos, también valdría el pariente varón más cercano. En el mundo descrito por Gurnah, el mapa del continente africano podía teñirse de colores según la nación que colonizó cada región, y él asigna un color según los países colonizadores que tomaron las distintas regiones del continente africano. Y en esa lógica, pienso, el cuerpo de las mujeres sería un continente monocromático, un solo color para expresar la colonización masculina, algo que sabemos que no es asunto del pasado. Vivimos en un país profundamente racista y clasista. En México se cometen 10 u 11 feminicidios cada día. ¿Cómo no comprender también las historias de Abdulrazak y entender que los procesos de descolonización son largos y dolorosos, atravesados por distintas violencias? Pero no todo es pesimista en la obra de Gurnah, porque también así es la vida. Y nos encontramos con mujeres que desean estudiar, capaces de tomar la iniciativa en una relación amorosa, en medio de sociedades machistas, inequitativas y patriarcales. Escoger una pareja les puede costar la vida. Y por fortuna también hay hombres que las apoyan, padres que les buscan un lugar en el mundo, hermanos que son cómplices. La literatura de Gurnah crea esperanza. Otra cualidad que encuentro es el sensible tratamiento de la vulnerabilidad de los niños, que pueden ser abandonados o abandonar ellos mismos el hogar sin que nadie los busque. Se van porque sufren, porque tienen hambre, se van casi sin conciencia de estar partiendo. Eso es muy conmovedor. Y en esas trayectorias de vida hay una belleza terrible, la de niños que se enfrentan a la buena o la mala fortuna de encontrar un destino solos. Pienso en todos esos que atraviesan el país, viniendo de Centroamérica, buscando a sus padres. En una nota final, me gustaría señalar la importancia de la lengua en sus libros. Nuestro autor es de Zanzíbar, Tanzania, y aunque ha escrito en inglés su obra literaria, su lengua materna es el suajili. Y es hermoso que la haga presente en lo que escribe. Es una forma generosa y justa de honrar un universo en resistencia. Esto lo decimos desde un país en el que se hablan, como hoy se dijo en la mañana durante la inauguración de la feria, 68 idiomas y 364 variantes lingüísticas. Su obra atraviesa géneros como el ensayo, el cuento, novelas, como las que ya he mencionado, y otras como A orillas del mar o Paraíso, nominada para los premios Booker. La crítica literaria ha señalado la influencia en su escritura de los relatos de las 1001 noches. Ustedes van a ver que es así. Hay que estar de acuerdo. Y además me gustaría cerrar con estas palabras leídas en El desertor y que describen a la perfección esa gran novela que es El desertor, que está acá afuera, la van a poder encontrar. Y estas palabras de Abdulrazak Gurnah describen, me parece, muy bien todo su universo narrativo. Dice, una historia que contiene muchas otras, ninguna de las cuales nos pertenece, sino que forman parte de las azarosas corrientes de nuestro tiempo, que se apoderan de nosotros y nos atrapan para siempre. Con ustedes, Abdulrazak Gurnah.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for being here. And thank you very much for that. I don't know, maybe the translator was adding things, but it sounded quite beautiful, what you were saying. I'd have been quite happy for you to go on talking for the next half an hour or so. But okay, I have to do my job now. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure to be traveling around various parts of South America for the last few weeks. It's the first real trip that I've been able to make here, and I've learned a great deal. All right. In 2017, I retired from my work as a professor of literature. And one of the small problems I had to deal with was to do with the books. There were over 20 boxes to take home, in addition to those that were already at home. How was I to decide what to keep and what to give away? There were some books which I had been teaching from, year in, year out, for decades, and I knew that I was not likely to read them again. There were others whose function was so narrowly pedagogical that it was no difficulty to offer those to younger colleagues or to graduate students. At first, it was a lot easier than I had imagined. Until I looked closely, I did not realize how many books remained on my office bookshelves out of sheer idleness, or because I had once taught the text, or someone had suggested that I read such and such, and I had succumbed. And there they sat, performing no other function than endorsing the breadth of my intellectual inquiries. They were the hard evidence of the width of my reading, should anyone have considered questioning it, of course. Many of those went unproblematically into the boxes intended for charity. That left me with the ones that I thought that I might read again, which was still a larger number of boxes than I had anticipated. The principle for the rest then became, what was I likely to reread? And would I regret it if I parted with them too soon? Will I ever read And Quiet Flows the Dawn again, having read it at least 4 or 5 times in years gone past? Or Catch-22? Or The Cherry Orchard, or The Blithedale Romance? Will I really read 7 Pillars of Wisdom again? In the event, I kept most of them, of course. So now then it was necessary to start rereading, to see if I had made the right choice in deciding to keep them. This was how I thought this through. Do I intend to reread because the text has receded in memory? Or because the memory of previous reading is pleasurable and the desire is to repeat the experience? Or was the previous reading experience disappointing and I wish to give the book another look to see if I had been hasty in my judgment or inattentive to the quality of what I was reading? Rereading the books turned out to be an unexpected pleasure in most cases, although in other cases I immediately remembered what had made me put the book down in the first place. In other words, I found out that rereading was itself a journey back. And while to a certain extent it is a journey of discovery, it is also one of rediscovery through memory. For a writer, or at least for a writer of a certain kind, memory is a crucial resource. I'm not referring to the ability to remember certain facts or details, but to memories that linger on long after the moment has passed, memories that live with us for all of our lives. These are not always subject to our will or control, not scenes and moments that we can always choose to remember, and maybe at times we try to disremember them. It is this form of memory that I think of as a writer's resource, involuntary and unavoidable, but rich in possibilities of enlightenment and disentanglement. Another way of speaking about memory is to describe it as experience. We remember what we have experienced in a profound sense of that word. In that respect, we are marked by our experiences, if not wholly made by them. We may experience events which befell us in person, or experience stories we have heard about other people and other places, or have heard as news or read as histories of people and places. they all become ours. Experience may also be dreams and imaginings that thrilled or baffled us. It is, in short, what we gather and understand in our trundle through existence. We read for comparably complex ends. There is pleasure in the engagement itself, difficult to describe, but palpable. That pleasure, it seems to me, is primary. It is not pleasure in the sense that we're made happier or we smile and laugh as we read, but something more profound happens, a kind of inarticulate delight. We see our inclinations and ideas expressed more persuasively than we are capable of doing ourselves. We are exposed to places and times and ways of thinking, some of which are familiar and some completely different. In other words, in addition to the pleasure of reading something beautifully or powerfully expressed, we also receive news. We learn. Rereading intensified these functions. The least of these functions, which the recall of memory performs, is to evoke nostalgia for a lost time, to speak a lament for a contentment which is no longer possible. Nostalgia, in the sense I have just invoked, would seem to refer to a kind of self-deception, an introspective desire to see what has passed more positively than the present state. And as scholars and students of literature, we are often skeptical of such tropes. Indeed, we're trained to be skeptical. And there are good reasons for this, both in reading literature and in living our lives. Because at worst, sentiment can also be a means of evasion, a refusal to acknowledge responsibility for what was done in our name. On the other hand, let us not be in a hurry to throw out this word nostalgia. It derives from the Greek word nostos, which means return, and algos, which means pain. And one of its meanings is the distress aroused by a yearning for one's place of origin. It is a yearning that those who have lost their homes know only too well. So, I've just referred to the way recollections for a lost time are taken to be sentimental and suspect and nostalgia. I suggested that we hang on to that word, at least in its sense of the distress aroused by a yearning for one's place of origin. I said earlier that it is a yearning that those who have lost their homes know only too well. So I'm now going to refer to somebody who knows this experience very well, and that's the Palestinian theorist and writer Edward Said. Towards the end of his memoir, Out of Place, that was the title of the memoir, Edward Said says this, I'm quoting, "To this day, I still feel that I am away from home." If you're not familiar with Edward Said, he spent most of his life teaching at Columbia University in New York. So I'd just like to dwell for a moment on what constitutes the ongoing memory of what has been lost and how Edward Said reflected on it. In the title essay of his collection of essays, which was called Reflections on Exile, Said made a distinction between exile and a refugee, and he had this to say, so I quote, "The word refugee has become a political one, suggesting large herds of innocent and bewildered people requiring urgent international assistance. Whereas exile carries with it, I think, a touch of solitude and spirituality. End of that quote. I draw attention to the hesitancy implied in that "I think." Let me read that again. Whereas exile carries with it, I think, a touch of solitude and spirituality. I draw attention to the hesitancy implied in that "I think," because this distinction is not stable in this discussion. Both figures, the refugee and the exile, dwell in the perilous territory of not belonging. But it is not clear in this suggestion, in this argument, if their condition is a particular product of specific historical circumstances, a consequence of an age of displacements, or if it is a paradigm. At times, it seems, in the way Said speaks of it, that exile is a choice. He says, James Joyce chose exile in his quarrel with Ireland. But Hemingway was an expatriate. This is Said, not me. In his youth in Cairo, Said described himself as an American. His father spent time in America and actually became a Marine in the American Army. So Said, although he was born in Palestine and grew up in Cairo, was an American. So in Cairo, Said described himself as an American when pressed to name his affiliation, but then later chose to be an exiled Palestinian. He warns against seeing the exile as heroic, as a figure of, his word, as a figure of romance, because to do so is to fail to see the damage inflicted by the process of exile. However, I don't think he's able to resist doing so, as he attempts to describe, I quote, the whole complex of pressures and constraints that lie at the center of the exile's predicament, which is as close as we come in the modern era to tragedy. End of quote. I find it important to be clear about this distinction. I think of exile as a principled condition, a choice made out of conviction, although circumstances may have made alternative choices unpalatable. The refugee, on the other hand, is produced by circumstances unequivocally out of his or her choice, by danger of life. The dislocation produced by such circumstances in recent decades has resulted in the intensification of border controls and the deliberate creation of the non-person, the generalized refugee, who is comparable to Agamben's Homo sacer, the figure abjured by the law but beyond the law's protection. Said cites Auerbach's citation of Hugo St. Victor. I quote, "He is perfect to whom the entire world is as a foreign land." Rather than the liberated spiritual cosmopolitan implied by this description, the current controls produce the detainee and ultimately the stateless person. In the essay that I've just been talking about, Said describes Joseph Conrad's story, Amy Foster, as, I quote, perhaps the most uncompromising representation of exile ever written. If you're not familiar with the story, Amy Foster, please read it. It's a beautiful story. I love this story too, as Said does. and find it illuminating in understanding something of the predicament of Conrad himself. So I'll tell you a little bit about the story, not only because you may not have read it, but because then I develop it a little bit so I show its relevance to the kind of point I'm trying to make. The location of the story is the Romney Marshes in Kent, in England, not far from where Conrad lived in the last 20 or so years of his life, and actually not far from where we live now. In characteristic Conrad style, the story is told to a narrator who plays no part in the drama, but whose presence and observation inflect its reception. So, it is the narrator who knows nothing about her who describes the young countrywoman Amy Foster, and he describes her as a dull creature. The teller of her story, the country doctor, is then able to amplify on this. She is passive, quote, everlastingly safe from all the surprises of the imagination. She has a curious want of definiteness in her all aspect. She stammers. She is tender to every living creature. To her employer, these were all signs of her stupidity, while to the doctor, these were hints of her ability to understand suffering, allowing us to see that the doctor is a man of sympathetic perception and deserving our respect. This poor creature fell passionately in love with a poor emigrant from Central Europe, shipwrecked on his way to America and washed ashore on this corner of the Kentish coast. He was, I quote, so different from the mankind around. This is the doctor speaking. He was so different from the mankind around. Olive complexion and graceful of bearing, lithe, supple and long-limbed, straight like a pine. He raises alarm among the villagers and farm workers for his outlandish appearance, as he sought help among them, unable to make himself understood. To the country people, he is a mysterious, satanic stranger, a figure of horror who's chased and hounded until finally he's caught and locked in a woodshed on the farm where Amy Foster works as a domestic servant. Conrad wants migration to seem an alienating and estranging experience. The journey across Europe, then battened down below deck with the other emigrants, all strangers to him, the shipwreck, and then the ordeal of several days at the hands of the country people. He was, we are told, a mountaineer of the eastern edges of the Carpathians. And if you know your geography, you'll know that's pretty close to Poland. These details are not revealed immediately to heighten the sense of his anonymity and strangeness, which is a very familiar technique of Conrad, as those of you who read Conrad will know. It is Amy Foster, tender to every living creature, remember that description, who had the imagination necessary to understand suffering and to extend a hand of kindness to the stranger, and to whom he becomes beholden and adoring. What follows then is courtship and love and marriage. But alongside this, the story charts the overwhelming loneliness of the stranger, whose foreignness is an indelible stamp and who is never able to overcome the hostility of the villagers. In the end, his strangeness overwhelms love, and Amy Foster flees from him in terror and leaves him to die, sick and abandoned, in the doctor's words, to perish in the supreme disaster of loneliness and despair. That then is the fate of Conrad's emigrants, to suffer such morbid estrangement. His name, by the way, is Janko Gural. I cannot think of this central figure as an exile in the way that Said describes him. Remember Said's description of the story Emmy Forster as perhaps the most uncompromising representation of exile ever written. Janko Gural is shipwrecked on a migrant ship on its way to the United States and is washed ashore on the southern coast of England, not far from where Conrad spent voluntarily the last decades of his life. Janko Gural does not know where he is and considers himself a fugitive, rightly afraid of injury from the natives. He cannot understand them, and they cannot understand him, and he can only find refuge when a farmer locks him up in a shed. He finds sympathy and love from an awkward peasant young woman who in the end rejects him, and he dies in sorrow and loneliness. To me, that sounds more like the experience of a refugee than an exile. In 1991, sorry, I have to check the time, I don't want to keep you here forever. In 1991, Edward Said was diagnosed with leukemia. And in a piece he wrote for the London Review of Books, which was called On Writing a Memoir, he describes the journey back. I'm quoting. So many returns, attempts to go back to bits of life or people who are no longer there. These constituted a steady response to the increasing rigors of my illness. In 1992, I went with my wife and children to Palestine for the first time in 45 years. In July 1993, I went on my own to Cairo, making it a point in the middle of a journalistic mission to visit old haunts. By the time I began treatment in March 1994, I realized that I had at last entered, if not the final phase of my life, then the period from which there will be no return to my old life. In May 1994, I began work on the memoir. That's the end of that quotation. So it is terminal illness that forces this journey back to the memoir which he called Out of Place, which was published in 1999. Although in many ways the journey was already underway some while before that. In the essay I mentioned earlier on, Reflections on Exile, which of course I'm trying to make an echo of it with the title of my talk rather. In that essay, Said comments, the exile must cultivate a scrupulous subjectivity. And it is this cultivation that enables a journey back through memory, and via memory to affiliation, and finally to the figure of the obstinate foreigner, which to me is the archetypal exile. In the concluding paragraph of the introduction to his collection of essays, Reflections on Exile, Edward Said wrote, "My hope in this book is to show that no return to the past is without irony or without a sense that a full return or repatriation is impossible. This may sound like a disavowal of the very process of recollection and reflection, to see it ironically as incapable of resolution. It is to cast doubt on the reliability of the exile's memory. And perhaps that is inevitable, because the condition of exile is also a catalogue of incomplete acts which are now left behind. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Abdulrazak Gurnah, por esta conferencia, y la fortuna es que tenemos la oportunidad de hacerle preguntas. Si quisieran, por favor, levantar la mano mientras se van asentando sus palabras, ¿no? Aquí hay una mano levantada. No sé si van a pasarles un micrófono. Sí. Ya vi. Aquí tenemos 2 preguntas y aquí una tercera. Empezamos por acá, con la persona que alzó la mano de este lado. Acá, por favor. Si te quieres levantar para que te vean y te den el micrófono. Sí.
It's okay, it's coming, it's coming.
No veo el viaje del micrófono. Perfecto. Gracias.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for what you wrote, and I really enjoy every book that you wrote. I just wanted to know how much of your books are self-biographic, and if you can sign me the books that I brought.
Okay, you just want to know about whether the books are autobiographical. I don't know if you all heard that. And whether I can sign copies of your book, right?
Yeah, please.
I believe there are going to be book signing a little later on, but there will be instructions about that. Yeah, autobiographical. This is, no, they're not really autobiographical. It depends what you mean. I mentioned something about experience when I was talking about, and how complex that is, that it's not simply what is my life, as it were. So when somebody says autobiographical, they mean that, is it a story of your life? You know, like the events are. In that case, I can say quite simply, no. My books are not autobiographical in that respect. But I can only rely on my experience, on what I know. And experience in that complex way is autobiographical. It is what you know. And what you know is both what you live through, what other people live through and tell you about it, what you hear and overhear, what you read about, and what you imagine. All of it is part of you. It comes out of what you know. So when a writer, of a certain kind anyway, sits there in front of the computer, the only resource they have is, and therefore it is autobiographical, no?
Hay otra pregunta aquí, con el...
Muchas gracias. Sorry, I will speak, well, I will try to speak in English, but if I get nervous, I will change to Spanish. Thanks a lot. It's an honor to be here. And I have 2 questions. The first is you have talked about this nostalgia of going back to a place where you have been exiled or a place that you have left behind. But here in Latin America, also we have this idea. I am thinking in authors like B.S. Naipaul or Derek Walcott of going back to a place that it is not ours, that has never been truly ours. My question is, where are, if there is like any authors, Latin American authors that have in any way change or guide your writing, or just to have like this part of Latin American literature? And the other question is, other thing in your work that I find very intense and very attractive is your prose. I think it's a very delicate prose, and I think that it's a prose that needs a lot of work. And I would like to know how is that you conceive your prose, and which are like also like the other writers or authors that have helped you write in the way that you do, because I think that it's very specific, the way that you write. And thanks.
Thank you. I think I counted at least 5 questions in there. Not 2, like you say. But okay, let me see if I can kind of like disentangle at least 1 or 2 of them. Your question about Walcott and Naipaul is very, very good, actually, because what they see as nostalgia is a historical nostalgia, a nostalgia for another time, which in both cases, both those writers want to resist, want to say that this is a kind of a fantasy in some sense or another. Although, of course, when Walcott comes to write Omerous, it's no longer a fantasy, because by then he's actually claiming that connection, whereas early on, in some of the early poems, like Divided, I can't remember the title, but when he's talking about the Mau Mau, he sees a distance between himself and Africa, let's say. Whereas Naipaul, I don't know where he is, but he's definitely seeing that connection with India, I suppose, or with Africa as kind of like a fantasy. But that's a different kind of thing from the nostalgia of the figure that has lost a place of origin. This is a different kind of nostalgia for some kind of historical sense of belonging to something else. So I would distinguish between those two. But in any case, it doesn't necessarily mean that kind of longing, that kind of yearning for another point of connection is stupid. It may well be a way of contesting another narrative that says you don't belong anywhere, or that you are rootless, or something like that, which is one of the narratives that is produced out of the experience of slavery, that you don't have a home. Your home is nowhere. Here. And here means bondage and nothing. Nothing here belongs to you. So one can both understand the kind of the resistance to the fantasy aspect of that, but also you have to see that it has its necessity in some way, to the kind of the desire to retrieve something from the historical experience. I can't remember all your other questions, though.
Aquí había la señora de rojo.
Me congratulo de haber escuchado esta magistral conferencia y mi pregunta es al respecto del exilio. Actualmente sabemos que la migración es un fenómeno ocasionado por los malos gobiernos y la geopolítica no debe ser obstáculo como para que ese fenómeno se frene cuando todos somos ciudadanos del mundo. En sus ideas plasmadas en su libro, ¿cuál sería en su concepto personal, cómo ha contribuido al respecto de este fenómeno migratorio mundial?
Yeah, I agree with you. But on the other hand, it's not something we can stop. It's not something we can say, okay, stop doing this now, stop moving around, stay at home. We can't do that. Human history has been full of moments for one reason or another, sometimes out of greed and avarice, sometimes out of need. And our current situation, while it may seem catastrophic. It really is no more catastrophic than other such moments in human history. What is missing now, or what is happening now in a dramatic way, in which perhaps hasn't happened quite such a dramatic way before, is that the movement is from formerly colonized territories in Africa and Asia to Europe. And of course, in South America, there's always been this. People are looking for prosperity, like people, when they were moving out of Europe in their millions to go and take over other people's lands, were also moving out of a desire for prosperity. There's nothing criminal about this, but it's represented as some kind of desire which is driven by criminality and malice or something like that. If we can put a stop to that, we'll be making a step in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Listening to you is very inspiring. And when I listen to you saying that about migration, about exilium, I believe that literature can be the right path. It can be like the path going forward for hope. And I would like to listen from you. What do you think? Is literature a path for helping, understanding this kind of phenomena?
You're asking too much of literature.
Oh.
Well, it's not literature that can do this. It's us. It's us. We have to, all of us, not just us, because we are kind of, as you were, we share certain kinds of ways of thinking. That's why we're all sitting in a room like this. But it's what people do, what people come to understand. So if literature plays any part in this, then it's not what its intention, if you know what I mean. I don't think you can say, what should literature do to make this happen? Primarily what we go to when we read is not to be told how to live our lives. When we go to read because it pleases us to read. And that pleasure, as I've tried to mention, is a complicated one. It's not just because it makes us happy, but it makes us understand, it makes us learn, it makes all sorts of other things better. Because, that's how I think. I think like that, or I didn't know that, or whatever. All of these ways in which we share our humanity, if you like, as we read. But if I read a book that says to me, all right, from now on, when you finish reading this book, go out and do this, I'll think, no, I'm not going to read this guy again. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not that we must not assume that literature or writing will tell us what to do. It will do whatever it is that it does. And people who write books are just like you and I, They just write books, they say what they think. And sometimes that makes us think harder and may make us think, well, I was wrong, or I was right, I'm so glad. But we mustn't ask too much of literature in that respect.
Aquí.
Hey, we gotta go home, man. There's too many. How many
Aquí, por favor.
questions? No.
Y ahorita vamos aquí. Había un micrófono aquí, ¿no? Sí, por favor.
Gracias. Thank you.
The first time I've heard the word oud.
Oud? Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay.
I never had a feeling of what it felt, of smelling it. So in your work, in one of your novels, you described perfectly well what it was the feeling about smelling that perfume from the wood. That is, I think that is a very special or very important part of literature, feelings, sensibility, because you made me journey this. You made me felt like it was like a journey to smell that particular memory of the person that went to England. Am I correct?
Yeah. Did you go and find some oud?
Yes, already. Yes.
You found some?
Yes.
Okay. That's good. See, that's what literature can do, you see?
Aquí en medio, por favor, y ahorita vamos para allá.
So it's good to have you here in Mexico.
Thank you.
I started to read your book By the Sea. I haven't finished it because I started a few days ago. And I was astonished or surprised when I was reading and got the idea that colonialism leaves scars on the people that were subject to that long after the colonialists went away.
Bring the camera.
Long after the colonialists went away. And I think also the colonialists get scars from being colonialists. So this is some kind of duality. But then you went from Tanzania to England, so from one country colonized to one colonialist country, and then you lived there and worked for many years, and in some sense you integrated, but under some sense you might be looked as an outsider. So how do you live this duality between being in a colonial country, coming from a colonialist country, and all this?
Okay. Well, it's not impossible. Necessity, Necessity is part of it. So when I went to England, I didn't think I was going to live in England. I thought I was going there for my own needs, which was to study so that I could live in the way that I wanted to live, to fulfill myself. But in the process of doing so, I could not return to my country. And this is often the case with people who make this decision to migrate. I was only 18, but people who make the decision to migrate, in a sense, it's a life commitment. You don't just say, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and try and go to whatever. It requires a lot of sacrifice, one kind or another, perhaps risks, all kinds of things. When you get there, you have to make it happen. You have to make it work. You have to do something. And quite a lot of the time, people are not able to say, I think I made a mistake, because they don't have the option to do so. They don't have the option to say, maybe this was not a good holiday, I'll go back home. So they have to stay and make it work, wherever it is. And that's why you can go and live in the country that formerly colonized you and make it work. And then you discover something quite important, I think, if it works, as many people do, that given the opportunity, or rather the country that admits you into their midst also discovers, that given an opportunity, people do not come without skills. They don't come empty-handed. They don't come to beg. They come because they have skills that they can learn, they can contribute, they can become part. And life invigorates you. And then you're there, and you're doing your best. That's how.
¿Les parece una pregunta más?
Is this the last one?
Last one. It's okay. Do you want to say? We can go.
Good night.
Hello.
Okay, I'm very grateful with you for being here tonight. Thank you. Welcome to Mexico. And I believe in the power of words, the power of books, and I think we all here are readers, as you. So my question is very simple. What does Abdulrazak reads? How do you choose a book? How do you choose what is the next book you're going to read? Thank you.
I
love that question.
I don't know. Quite often these things happen rather than, it's not that I I might read something in the newspaper, for example, that might mention a book and think, yeah, that sounds interesting, I'll read that. More often than not these days, I must admit, it's the books come to me rather than that I choose them. But, I don't have to, people write and say, I've got this book, would you be interested in reading it, and this kind of thing. And very often there are books that haven't been published, so I get I get to know what's going on. But I also choose, like you'll have gathered from what I was saying earlier on, I also choose to read things that I've read before, which sometimes because something triggers the memory, or I read something else that mentions that, I think, yeah, I remember that, and I go and read that book again. I think for writers, reading is more or less a professional activity. You not only write, but you read all the time. But for a writer who's also spent most of his adult life also being a teacher of literature, reading is kind of a double profession. So I read all the time. Sometimes out of choice, but sometimes simply because I see there's an obligation to read certain things, because it's really part of my profession. I read whatever's there. If you've got something for me to read, I'll go and read it. So long as it's not in Spanish, because I can't read in Spanish. Okay?
Queremos ir cerrando, aunque ya están muy insistentes.
This is like, photographers always say, okay, one more shot. And it's a lie, because the 3 shots, and they say, could you stand over there? One more, just one more. One more. All right, one more.
Al fondo, allá, por favor. O acércate tú al micrófono, creo que puede ser más fácil.
Okay. Solo un agradecimiento, ya que me dieron el micro. 1 minuto o menos. I would just like to thank you before giving the mic for dedicating your words in your presentation to bring the reflection around the Palestinian situation regarding exile and being a refugee, and that being like a counterpart of an embodied experience. And I received this as your intention to plant the seeds here in the room for us to keep our curiosity around the Palestinian situation alive, given the current circumstances. Thank you very much for dedicating your words.
Thank you.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Noches ya. La pregunta es, los límites, ¿qué tanto los límites o el dolor nos pueden llevar o son necesarios para reencontrarnos? Y en todo esto también el poder, justamente ahorita que yo estaba insistiendo, ¿qué tanto poder tiene la insistencia para poder formar parte de una nueva comunidad y poder mostrar las habilidades que uno tiene y ser también pues bien recibido?
I think you just work hard. No, I think to be sympathetic, to understanding, to be open to understanding, to be open to a kind of... You see, one of the things that depresses me very much about the way you hear the condition, the needs of people like asylum seekers or refugees, the way they're spoken about. What distresses me about that is inhumane. It's not humane. It's not kind. It's not sympathetic. at least, it's as if these prime ministers and bankers and whoever, as if they don't understand something simple about human need. So, yeah, just keep working at it, that's all. Keep saying it. Keep saying sympathy, kindness, humanity, justice. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Abdulrazak Gurnah, por esta conferencia, por estas últimas palabras. Me parece que no hay más que añadir. Gracias de nuevo. Gracias por venir a México y siempre bienvenido a nuestro país. Gracias a ustedes también. Buenas noches.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Amazing, your words.
Thank you.
Do you want to